Well, I think he will become the next king in Saudi Arabia because he is essentially neutralized all effective opposition. I don't think the United States has the capacity to appoint kings in Saudi Arabia anyway. The Taiwan issue is moving toward a crunch point, and I think Iraq is beginning to reassert a more independent voice in regional affairs. That was what Abdulaziz Saud did. He created his own. The role of the foreign intelligence agencies has been very considerable. I don't know how much that will continue. I don't know the details of the cooperation, but there clearly was coordination and cooperation. The Houthis have earned a lot of credit in the Arab world generally, in the Islamic world, for supporting Palestinians with direct attacks on Israel. The Turks are in control of the greater part of Syria. That is to say, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Hello everyone and welcome to our channel. I'm Dr. Hamzah Alkinani and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a new episode. Today I'm honored to host Ambassador Chas Freeman, an experienced US diplomat who will share his profound insights on several critical political issues in the region, West Asia, or as it is often called, the Middle East. In this episode, we'll delve into a range of topics, including the situation in Syria, political changes across West Asia, and the roles of major powers in shaping the region's future. Thank you so much for joining me, dear Charles. I'm truly excited to have you with me today.
Glad to join you, Hamza.
First of all, I would like to hear your brief political analysis of what's happening in Syria so far, especially after Bashar al-Assad's fall without resistance.
Well, I think that there's quite a tangle of foreign powers involved still in Syria. After all, there was a major effort by Saudi Arabia and the United States earlier to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government. The Saudis more recently have normalized relations with that government, but we have very different objectives between Israel, Turkey, the Gulf Arab states, and of course Iran. Iran is essentially out of the picture now in Syria. The Turks are in control of the greater part of Syria. That is to say, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which has formed a government in Syria, is very beholden to the Turks. It was helped into power, I should say, by the Turks, the United States, and Israel. The Turkish objective in Syria, I think, is twofold. First, they won't have a united Syria in which Kurdish power and independence is curbed, so that they plan to go into the area of Syria that is controlled by the Kurds, who they regard as allied with the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey, and force them to capitulate to Turkish power. They will probably have the assistance of the al-Jolani government, or Shara government, if you will, in this. But their objective of a united Syria beholden to them, a sort of satellite or an extension of Turkish power, will bring them into conflict with Israel. Israeli objectives in Syria have always been to fragment the country, preferably into 4 or 5 small statelets. Israel has seized land in Syria on the Golan Heights and beyond it, very close to the capital of Damascus. There's every indication that, as usually has been the case, temporary Israeli occupation is more permanent than anything else. There's nothing quite as permanent as a temporary Israeli occupation. So I think people are correctly concerned that Israel is making a big land grab. And we see this actually with the Israeli, now the foreign ministry, showing the enlarged map of Israel, which includes territory west to the Nile River and north and east to the Euphrates. It includes parts of Saudi Arabia, all of Jordan, parts of Iraq, all of Syria. So the religious Zionists who are in control in Jerusalem are very ambitious. And finally, we have the Gulf Arab states who are trying to make sure that the new government in Syria is not, that it is in fact what it claims to be, which is a Salafi movement that is moderate and respectful of other faiths and minorities. Why should the Gulf Arabs care about that? Because they have suffered from terrorism from Salafi forces outside Gulf, and they do not want to have this happen again. I should say finally that because Israel has emerged as the dominant power in the Levant, having pushed Hamas underground, having weakened Hezbollah, having now taken part of Syria, having opened a path to attack Iran if it chooses to do so, we're seeing an acceleration of the rapprochement between the Gulf Arabs and Iran. So we're seeing enhanced cooperation there. In effect, the American-Israeli objective, which had been to create an anti-Iranian coalition involving Israel and the Gulf Arabs, has been reversed. And we're now seeing a Gulf Arab-Iranian coalition aiming at blocking Israel. This is just beginning, but I think that is the direction of events. I'm sorry to give you such a long answer, but Syria is probably the most complicated country on the planet, composed of many, many minorities, a Sunni majority, which is mostly secular. I don't know how Syria is going to develop. I have great difficulty imagining liberal democratic jihadis running a liberal democratic Syria, as they pretend they are going to do.
But you mentioned, Mr. Freeman, a very important point. If the large Arab countries like Saudi Arabia did not tolerate Morsi because he was associated with the religious movement, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, lacking political competence in managing a state, and he allied with Turks who have always interest in the Arab resources, and also allied with small country like Qatar, will they tolerate al-Julani, who received support from Turkish intelligence group and Qatari media and represents a jihadist religious movement?
Well, to be honest, the challenge is quite different from the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course has the sympathy of Turkey and also the support historically of Qatar, which is one of the reasons for the divisions in the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's very different because if you talk to, let's say, Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, you will hear them say, look, in the past, if you had a moral agenda in politics in the Arab world, you had to rely on a general, a dictator, a thug, a prince, maybe, or a king. But we don't need that. What we can rely on power directly from the ballot box, directly from the people. Well, this is a direct challenge to the theory of monarchy in the Gulf. And it is, of course, compatible with those sections of the Holy Quran, which are not very complimentary about monarchy, about kings. So this is a problem, but it's a different problem in the case of Syria, because it doesn't appear that there's going to be any election there for about 4 years. So it's not at all clear that this is a movement that has any use for the Muslim Brotherhood itself. And it may be ideologically more compatible with the traditional concept of governance by a strong man with shura, consultation, as the means of policy formation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Freeman. Let us watch this clip and then return to our discussion.
هلق للسوريين بشكل عام يجب أن نعترف بأننا حققنا. هلا ستسمع الكثير من النظريات وخاصة نظريات المؤامرة إنه يعني اتفاق دولي ومؤامرة دولية وما بعرف شو من هالكلام اللي بتسمعه كثير ودنيا. أنا أريد أن أؤكد لكل السوريين بأن ما حصل كان نصرا سوريا مؤزرا بحتا.
أخذوا قرارات سريعة، وهنا برأيي كانوا مستقلين في قرارهم، يعني لم تتدخل دول، لم يعرف أحد، العالم كله تفاجأ. لماذا أقول ذلك؟ شوفي، عشية هذه العملية حتى الأمريكان، تركيا تفاجأت، بالتأكيد تفاجأت. حصل هذا الانهيار، فاجأ الجميع، كانت هناك قوة لديها استقلالية قرار لتستمر وتواصل المسير إلى دمشق. طيب هذا تعرفي هذا من الأشياء التي تحصل مثل تعرفي أحجار الدومينو لما تنهار، انهارت حما وبعدين كأنه حصلت لحظة سحرية. أنا أحيانا أفكر فيها كثيرا على فكرة، يعني ما هي اللحظة السحرية اللي تنهار فيها النظام وأصبح الجميع لا يعطي أوامر للجنود للتوقف أو للذهاب إلى بيوتهم؟ لا أعتقد أنه كانوا منسقين مع بعض. في شيء بيحصل، بصير في تغير نوعي حقيقي.
I know you mentioned that at the beginning of this interview, and I know we have moved beyond the topic of the intelligence cooperation in Syria, but for more clarity, in Arab media, it's often said that Assad's fall was mainly due to jihadist groups like HTS, with no external support. It's also noticeably that Qatar and Turkey back HTS through media. As a former US intelligence head candidate, what role did you see? What role did international intelligence agency play in Syria? Is there any more details you want to share with us?
I don't know the details of the cooperation, but there clearly was coordination and cooperation. The United States has a long history of trying to overthrow the Assad family in Syria, which has been in power until very recently, since 1970. In fact, the first American effort to overthrow the government in Syria was in 1947, even before the Assad regime came into power. And of course, for quite a long period in the 21st century, Saudi Arabia was a part of the effort to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. The 2011 uprising at Daraa in southern Syria clearly had foreign sponsors. Anyway, the role of the foreign intelligence agencies has been very considerable. I don't know how much that will continue. I have a feeling that, as I mentioned earlier, Turkey and Israel are likely to be at odds with each other rather than cooperative in Syria. They have very different objectives, which are not compatible. And I think the Turks will be quite jealous about controlling Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, if they can, on the new government, will be highly dependent on them. Turkish construction companies will be crucial for any effort to rebuild Syria, which is absolutely necessary. So I think we've gotten beyond the point where the intelligence agencies cooperate in Syria, and we're likely to see more competition than cooperation. I can imagine that MIT, the Turkish intelligence service, and Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, will be against each other rather than cooperating.
Thank you so much, Mr. Freeman. Shifting from intelligence activities to a broader regional dynamic. In the recent few years, we have seen the U.S. push for many initiatives in the region, like Abraham Accords, the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Law, formerly known as the Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act in 2019. Also, Israel was moved to the Central Command, CENTCOM, after previously being part of the European Command, ECOM. So, do you think the region is headed for a major political shift? Also, is there a possibility of Syria being divided?
I don't think the Arab countries want to see Syria divided, and I don't think the Turks want that. Clearly, Israel wants that, and the United States historically has been open to accepting that. So I think we have a situation in Syria in which, as I said, the Turks are likely to intervene against the Kurds. And I think, frankly, to go to the broader question you raised about the Abraham Accords, that these are essentially on life support. Arab publics have been utterly disgusted, correctly so, by the genocide in Gaza. Israel has lost all moral authority, the United States with it, because we have been totally identified with Israeli policy. This has greatly diminished our influence in the region. We are able to deal with the leaders in the region, but they are now feeling, I think, some constraints from public opinion. Even the United Arab Emirates, which is the supreme practitioner of realpolitik in the region, I think has to now be careful about what it does with Israel in a way that it wasn't earlier. We have also the change in Israel. You know, it's very interesting to me that every regime change that has taken place since 2011 in West Asia and North Africa has been away from secular government and toward religious-dominated regimes. And so we have Colonel Gaddafi, who was a very bad ruler in many ways, but was secular. He was not, did not have a religious. We had the Assads, even though they were Alawi, they were not pushing a particularly religious perspective. They were playing off one faction, religious faction, against another to retain power. And Syria was a very secular state. Yemen, prior to the al-Houthi takeover, also was secular. And so we now see everywhere secular government giving way to religious fervor. And that is the case in Israel. Israel had a secular government. It is now dominated by religious fanatics. And so I wonder, I go back to the question of whether Hayat Tahrir al-Sham will actually prove to be as secular as it claims to be. It is making a big play, the new government in Syria, for Western support. It is getting some Western support. We've just had a meeting in Riyadh between the German foreign minister and the Saudi side, in which the Germans have pledged, I think, 50 million euros in initial support for the new government in Syria. So there's quite an effort being made to try to realize the relative moderation of that the new regime in Syria claims. I'm frankly skeptical that this is going to work. And I think that just the concerns about the extremism of the new group are well placed. There have not been apparently very many serious efforts to persecute Shia or Christians or Druze or the other groups who make up Syria, but there have been some. And it's pretty clear that some of the group is pretty extremist. Here I want to note a contradiction or another problem. The new regime has put Uyghurs into command positions in the new Syrian armed forces. If you want to have rebuilding supported by China, this is probably not a smart thing to have done. But these Uyghurs are indeed extremists. They are producing propaganda films which urge Chinese to rise up and do everything that the Jabhat al-Nusra did before it went through its metamorphosis. So this is a very confused situation. And I think it's just very unclear what is going to happen. But I would say it's significant that the major players are all West Asians. The United States is no longer a major factor. Europe is not a major factor. And we have the question hanging over Syria of what happens to the Syrian refugees in Europe or in Turkey. 3.5 million of them in Turkey. And lots of ethnic tension between Turks and Syrian Arabs. And I think the Turkish government clearly wants these people to go back to Syria. Will they do that? What kind of atmosphere will there be in Syria to enable them, to entice them to return? What will happen in Europe? Will European xenophobia result in kicking out the large Syrian population? Lots of things, very uncertain.
Right, Mr. Freeman, let us talk about the other major power in the region, Russia. Russia is smart in setting its strategic priorities. From a Russian perspective, do you think the events in Syria are linked to the Ukraine war and linked to Russian presence in Libya? Also, what is the future of the Russian military bases in Syria?
Well, that is apparently under negotiation between the new government in Damascus and Moscow. In the meantime, the Russians have moved, they have hedged, in effect, by moving a significant portion of their presence in the Mediterranean to Libya, where they have friends among the contending factions. I think we have to recognize that the Russians are quite good at setting strategic priorities. And Syria is a secondary issue for them. Ukraine is far more important. The Ukrainians actually apparently aided Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with drone technology, among other things, in an effort to get back at the Russians. I think the Russians are playing a very cautious game. But I note that one of the effects of the fall of the Assad government is an acceleration in Russian-Iranian cooperation. And that relationship, in a few days, I think on the 17th of January, they are to sign a major treaty between Tehran and Moscow, formalizing an alliance. This is something new. I don't know how others in the region will react to it. If I'm right, that Iran is now a potential partner of the Gulf Arabs in balancing Israel, this could be very interesting.
If you're seeking a space where intellect is valued, where deep, rational analysis meets global perspectives, you have found it. Explore the world's most important issues. Follow Dr. Hamzah Alkinani to enrich the mind, not arouse emotions. Find him at Dr. HK88 on X, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
Mr. Freeman, the Wall Street Journal recently published that Arab countries are cautious about the new Syrian administration, especially since they want to compete with Turkey and prevent Syria from falling under Turkish influence as Iraq fell to Iran. Do you think because of the unique relationship between Trump and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, do you foresee changes in the political landscape?
I'm really not sure how durable the relationship between Donald Trump and Mohammed bin Salman is. I think both of them are very transactional. They're very focused on their own benefits and their own advantages, and they're not exactly the most empathetic people in understanding the viewpoint of others and playing to it. I think when Donald Trump went to Riyadh soon after he was inaugurated in his first term, that the public relations companies that the Saudi government had hired did a brilliant job of feeding his ego and making him feel very good about himself. I don't think the Saudis have lost the ability to do that, but things have changed. Saudi policy is much more independent than it was. Saudi Arabia has been deliberately diversifying its international relations. It has quite an active relationship now with China, which from the American point of view is a problem. It has an active relationship with Russia. Think of the cooperation around OPEC and about managing the world oil supply. It has offered itself as a neutral party in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, hosting a variety of meetings on Saudi soil. It is not aligned with the United States against China, against Russia, and it has also built quite an important relationship with India, which is a rising power, which traditionally has exercised a lot of influence in the Gulf. So I'm not sure whether you can predict what will happen on the basis of the realities of 4 or 5, 6, 7 years ago. There have been huge changes in the region. Not the least of these is the American alignment with Israel in Gaza and the West Bank, and American support of a war on Lebanon, which, although it was directed at Hezbollah primarily, is not very popular in the Arab world either. I wouldn't be confident that personal relationship will exercise the sort of influence that many people imagine it would.
Mr. Charles, speaking of military interventions, let us explore their border implications. Do you think the US and British military actions these days in Yemen against the Houthis are the same actions that happened with the Hezbollah and Lebanon? By the way, do you think they are still Iran's proxies in the region or not?
No, I don't believe that. I think every effort, whether by Saudi Arabia or others outside Yemen, to bring Yemen under control is doomed to fail. The Houthis have earned a lot of credit in the Arab world generally, in the Islamic world, for supporting Palestinians with direct attacks on Israel. They are the only, the al-Houthi leadership is, in fact, the only leadership in the Arab world that has been prepared to stand firmly with the Palestinians against the French, the Americans, the Israelis, and they have successfully inaugurated the world's first land-based sea blockade. Nobody's ever done this before. They don't seem to have any unwillingness to take punishment, as the Saudis learned when the war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So no, I don't think so. I think the Houthis are a problem for everybody because they are very independent. And I don't like the phrase Iranian-backed Houthis. Yes, Iran uses the Houthis, but the Houthis are also using Iran. And this is not a case of the Houthis being the slaves of Tehran. They are not. They are very independent-minded. And I would say Hezbollah actually was pretty independent-minded too, under its previous leader, its late leader. It was very cautious. Sometimes Iran wanted it to do things and it wouldn't do them.
Do you think it would be in the US interest for Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to become the next king of Saudi Arabia during President Trump's administration?
Well, I think he will become the next king in Saudi Arabia because he has essentially neutralized all effective opposition. There's a lot of dissatisfaction in some quarters in the royal family, but the populace as a whole continues to hold him in high regard. And I don't think the United States has the capacity to appoint kings in Saudi Arabia anyway. The Saudis will do that. You might not like the question of which Saudis do that is something that some Saudis may argue about, whether it's a good thing that the bay'ah comes from the family only or not. But I think Mohammed bin Salman has taken care of his accession to the throne pretty effectively. And his father, whom I regard as a friend, is not much in command of his faculties at this point. So in effect, Mohammed bin Salman, rather like the late King Abdullah, is in charge. If Fahd had a stroke, Abdullah ran the government. The Al-Suderi group were marginalized. Then they came back with a vengeance under Salman. And now the Saudi constitutional system, which involved shura, widespread consultation, and not just within the royal family, but with merchants and wealthy people and ordinary people, tribal groups. This has all been shattered. Now we have basically one man, Mohammed bin Salman, who can make decisions on his own. And he has done it. Many reforms that many Saudis welcome. Religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, for the most part, has been marginalized in terms of opposition to these reforms. And I think the man is in charge. I think he will stay in charge.
Ambassador Charles, how do we evaluate China's position in what's happening in the West Asia? And what is the future of Taiwan's conflict?
Well, those are two huge questions. China remains mostly interested in developing markets, investment, and cooperation. It is not engaged in geostrategic maneuvering. Its interests are primarily economic. They have to do with markets, with oil and gas supplies, and so forth. The Taiwan issue is moving toward a crunch point. There are no obvious paths to a peaceful resolution of the Chinese Civil War, and it looks like it's about to get back into combat. Just the other day, the Chinese were discovered to be building a huge number of barges, very innovative design, intended to land troops and heavy equipment in Taiwan during an invasion. Now, whether they actually plan to invade or not is something only they know, but clearly they're getting ready to do that. And the United States does not have an effective counter to that. The military balance in the Taiwan area now favors China. If there were a war, the estimates are that we might lose as much as half or 2/3 of our Navy and Air Force, which would cripple us as a global power. So this is not a trivial matter. China would suffer equally, and there is a real danger this could escalate to the nuclear level, which is why the Chinese are greatly expanding their nuclear deterrent force. This is a very dangerous situation, but it can't be dealt with in 2 or 3 minutes.
Mr. Freeman, after Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, what about Iraq? What is the future of Iraq's political system in the internal politics and the regional affairs? Can you talk to that, please?
I am not sure. I've always believed Iraqi nationalism was more important than religious identity. That is to say, Iraqis are, in fact, a fairly coherent country. It's complicated, of course. The tribal groups in Saudi Arabia reach into Iraq. These are Sunni, some of them are Shia. But I think the relationship between Iraq and Iran has always been a bit uncomfortable. And I think Iraq is beginning to reassert a more independent voice in regional affairs. And I note that after severing communication with it, the Gulf Arabs have all chosen to compete with Iran for influence in Iraq, and we shall see what happens. But Iraq remains a unified country despite the Kurdish autonomy in the north. And I think that it will continue to hold. For a long time, I thought the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided West Asia as the Turkish Ottoman Empire fell, was falling apart. I'm not so sure now. I think people have a stake in the nations that agreement ultimately created. Of course, Saudi Arabia created itself. That was what Abdulaziz Saud did. He created his own nation, which now recognizes itself as a nation. It's gone through many, many changes. Sometimes it has professed an Arab identity. Sometimes it has professed an Islamic identity. Now it professes a Saudi identity. So I think this is a trend that these countries in the region, which many had regarded as fragile, really have some roots in staying power. We shall see in Syria. That is, of course, the question you opened with, and it's the question that remains unsettled.
Mr. Freeman, as we conclude this conversation, if you had the opportunity to share a message or piece of advice with our followers who are interested in international politics, what would it be? Especially considering the prevalence of misinformation from media outlets that often promote specific agendas at the expense of genuine political awareness and critical analysis.
Well, I do prefer the term West Asia, because it is not a European perspective or an American perspective. For Europe, that's the Near East. For the United States, it's the Middle East. For the people who live there, it's West Asia, I think. I would say that the direction of global politics is not toward a bipolar order between the US and China, as some in the United States imagine, but toward what I call multinodal politics, nodes being points with multiple connections of different amplitudes that are it's a three-dimensional concept. It can change. It's not polar. Polar is a linear two-dimensional concept. And the result of this, the rise of what some people call a multipolar order, which I don't think is accurate, gives middle-ranking powers, for example, Saudi Arabia, opportunity to seize control of their own destiny. That is to say, external powers have dominated West Asia throughout much of history. I think this is a moment when the countries there, whether they're Iran or Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, or perhaps a newly reinvigorated Syria, certainly Turkey, maybe Egypt, if it recovers from its coma, then this is an opportunity for middle-ranking powers to take leadership positions in global politics. And I think the Islamic world is on the verge of a renaissance. It has not happened yet, but it will happen, just as Japan had successfully modernized itself in a Japanese way. China has successfully modernized itself in a Chinese way. India may or may not be modernizing itself in a Hindu way. I think the Islamic world is on the verge of doing the same. So this is a moment of opportunity, and countries in the region should seize it. Pursue your own interests. Don't pursue the interests of external powers.
Again, dear Charles Freeman, thank you so much for being with me today. At the end of our show today, thanks to you also, our dear followers. Until we meet again, here is Hamzah Alkinani, to enrich the mind, not to arouse emotions.